10.
On June 16, 1864, the city of Denver was terrified by the warning of an imminent enemy attack. During the previous night, a rancher named William Shortridge entered the city to alert everyone that he had seen a band of indigenous warriors approaching. The people panicked, believing that it was an attack by the Cheyenne. Immediately, the residents of Denver tried to protect themselves. People in the area ransacked the local armory, after which they took cover inside buildings with barricades. But they soon learned that the band of warriors that Shortridge saw on the horizon was actually a cloud of dust created by a cattle stampede. The animals were being driven by a group of drunk Mexican cattle drivers, who'd provoked the stampede. In those times, it was common to see thousands of cattle being driven by cowboy bands across hundreds of kilometers of open land. So it was a common livestock activity that mobilized the entire city of Denver that day, combined with a good dose of fear.
Number 9.
On April 23, several American satellites and ground systems detected a large explosion in the atmosphere, at a height of almost 30 kilometers, 19 miles. The explosion occurred in the early morning 1,800 kilometers, 1,118 miles, from San Diego, California. While the satellites detected the flashes of the explosion, the shock wave was sensed even 11,000 kilometers, 6,835 miles, away in Germany. If this isn't enough to illustrate the magnitude of the event, scientists estimated it was similar to a small nuclear explosion, releasing a quarter of the energy of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So the US government had solid reasons to worry about this issue. Given the exceptionally inconvenient timing of the occurrence, tensions began to increase again in Washington. Then, the Pentagon came to save the day and assured the authorities that there was no danger. The explosion was not caused by an enemy bomb but by a meteor 3 meters, 10 feet, long that could not withstand its entry into the atmosphere. The researchers studying the event stated that had the meteor reached the Earth shortly before or after, the explosion would have happened over a large city.
Number 8.
On May 22, 1955, the residents of Gelman Woods Landing, Wyoming, heard a strange and deep noise that was immediately followed by an earthquake. Inside many houses, the dishes and cupboards began to shake uncontrollably. Meanwhile, the earthquake also caused a group of fishermen to end up trapped inside their tent. In the midst of the chaos, a frightened Gelm resident quickly concluded that the earthquake had been caused by an atomic bomb which had been dropped on Denver. Of course, such an assumption was based on the common fear of an imminent nuclear war at that time, although it proved to be an incorrect conclusion.
Number 7.
In September 2016, India launched an attack on the border with Pakistan after militants killed 19 Indian soldiers that month. India made a precise attack on Pakistani launch pads in the area, causing numerous casualties on the enemy side. Then, a few hours after the event, the inhabitants of the city of Srinagar witnessed something that made them fear for their lives to an extreme degree. When they looked up, they saw a streak of light descending across the sky above their heads. The residents panicked at the thought that it was a missile launched by Pakistan in retaliation for the previous attacks by India. But soon, the Indian government calmed the population by explaining that what they saw was not a missile but a simple meteorite.
Number 6.
To detect any attack by the Soviets in advance, the U.S. Army placed missile detection systems in Alaska, Greenland, and the United Kingdom. On May 23, 1967, all three systems stopped working simultaneously. The American authorities were convinced that such thing could only be sabotage by the Soviets, which would be enough to start a full-scale war. So the U.S. Air Force authorized the deployment of fighter jets equipped with nuclear weapons. A new world war was approaching on the horizon, being only minutes away from beginning. Just in time the scientists realized that the American radars were not sabotaged by the Soviets but that the solar flare had hit them.
Number 5.
It was 3:42 a.m. on July 28, 1976. When the ground in the city of Tangshan began to shake violently. In just half a minute, most of the buildings across dozens of kilometers around collapsed to the ground, killing at least 240,000 people. And we know that the first thing that came to minds of survivors to explain what was happening was a nuclear war. They had reasons to believe something like that. Tangshan seemed like an obvious target to be attacked first by the Soviets, since it was an industrial city. Another thing that seems to have terrified the victims even more is that, shortly before the earthquake, they could see big flashes of light in the sky. For a moment, these lights might have seemed reminiscent of a nuclear explosion, although they were a natural phenomenon known as earthquake lights. A geologist in the area saw the lights and immediately proceeded to take shelter. Although the earthquake was not the result of a nuclear bomb, it had the power of one. It is estimated that the event released the same energy as 400 Hiroshima atomic bombs.
Number 4.
In August 2012, the Indian Army began to report sightings of bright objects flying in the sky. The troops assumed that these lights were actually Chinese spy drones, so they decided to keep a daily track of the objects. By February 2013, the Army had sighted the mysterious lights 329 times. And on 155 of those occasions, the objects seemed to have entered Indian airspace, violating the agreed territorial limit. As expected, these events heated up the situation between India and China. But fortunately, the Indian Army did not rush to take action and instead decided to call the Indian Institute of Astrophysics to be sure of the origin of the objects sighted. After the military gave them the collected data on the time and trajectory of the lights, the astronomers concluded that what the former had actually seen was Jupiter and Venus. It seems that the atmosphere had distorted the apparent brightness of these planets at the altitude of more than 4,700 meters, 15,420 feet, where the troops were located.
Number 3.
The following story comes from the words of Douwerhet himself and is contained in his book The Command of the Air. In November 1915, 2 Austrian planes bombed the city of Brescia, Italy. The result was 7 dead and 10 injured, all of them civilians. Then, Douwerhet says that during funeral services for the dead, one of the mourners mistook a bird for another enemy bomber approaching and thus aroused panic among the others present. Douwerhet used this anecdote as an example to demonstrate the enormous, long-lasting impact on an emotional level that an aerial bombing would have on the civilian population, ultimately demoralizing the enemy country itself.
Number 2.
During the Cold War, American systems of missile detection had serious difficulties when it came to differentiating natural phenomena from an enemy attack. They were slow and unable to handle large amounts of data, which sometimes led them to misinterpret unexpected events. One particular case of this type occurred in 1960. A missile detection system placed in Greenland was directly connected to the High Command of the U.S. Air Force. On October 5 of that year, the system sent an alert about a massive Soviet attack directed at the United States, composed of dozens of nuclear missiles. The system showed a 99.9% certainty that the attack was real, so the U.S. military panicked and fell into chaos. The Strategic Air Command, SAC, a former division within the Air Force and the Department of Defense, went into its highest alert level. This meant that the authorities would have only a few minutes to make a decision. The president had just 10 minutes to decide whether to launch a counterattack or not. However, some people in the division began to doubt that an attack was really taking place. A nuclear strike on American soil did not make much sense when, at that very moment, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was visiting New York. So a member of the SAC decided to check the alert data of the detection system again. Then, he realized it was all a mistake. What the early warning system in Greenland had actually captured was the moon rising on the horizon over Norway. Since nobody had adjusted the system to ignore the interference of the moon, the computers interpreted its emergence as a fleet of missiles about to blow up America. Soon, everything was calm again, and this unfortunate event forced the United States to improve its defense systems.
Number 1.
During the first days of July, the 43rd U.S. Division arrived in New Georgia and deployed troops from the 172nd and 169th Infantry on the coast of Zanana Beach. Their target, an airfield occupied by the Japanese, was a few kilometers away, and surprisingly, there were no traces of the enemy on the coast. It seemed that the operation would be quick. But it only appeared so. The only way to reach the airfield was to cross the dense jungle through a horrible footpath called the Munda Trail, and a lot of Japanese soldiers were hiding there. While the 172nd Infantry knew how to defend themselves relatively well, the soldiers of the 169th were inexperienced in combat. To spend the night, they dug small trenches called foxholes, but these were too far apart from each other. Taking advantage of the darkness, some Japanese silently got into foxholes and murdered the Americans or shouted phrases to demoralize them. Little by little, the men of the 169th began to lose their sanity. They did not sleep and confused everything they saw or heard with Japanese soldiers. Phosphorescence on rotten logs was seen as Japanese signals, the repulsive smell of the jungle was poisonous gas, and the land crabs moving through the vegetation were Japanese approaching. The American soldiers gave in to their fear and started shooting or throwing grenades at everything in the middle of the night. In the morning, the results of this mayhem became evident. Many soldiers of the 169th had killed each other after mistaking their comrades for the Japanese. Although the U.S. soldiers ultimately defeated the Japanese and took over New Georgia, the 169th Infantry suffered a psychological torment like no other troop in that engagement.